You know, when you hear filibuster, you probably picture, like, a senator talking for hours on end, right?
That's the common image, yeah.
But get this. There was apparently a time a senator almost threw a spittoon at another guy during one.
Oh, wow.
And another time, someone just read the DC phone book aloud just to, stall.
Yeah, some of the stories are pretty wild, and that's kind of what we're digging into today. These moments, they're part of this long and honestly, surprisingly unplanned history of the filibuster.
Right.
And you shared a really fascinating collection of sources. We've got stuff from Mental Floss, City Journal, looking at the history, some interesting takes from Reddit discussions, plus more foundational context from Wikipedia, the National Constitution Center, the Brennan Center for Justice, PBS's History Detectives, and even Merriam-Webster for the word's origin.
Which is pretty colorful in itself, apparently.
It really is, hints at its disruptive nature.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is basically to unpack the filibuster, what it is, where it came from, and it seems like it was kind of an accident.
A bit, yeah. In the U.S. context, anyway.
And then get into some of the really strange but also important ways it's been used. And here's a kicker. It's not just a U.S. Senate thing.
That's a key point. It pops up in different forms elsewhere.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What is a filibuster, fundamentally?
So at its core, it's a political procedure, right? A tactic used in a legislature, could be a Senate, a parliament, whatever, to delay or just completely block a decision, usually a vote on a bill.
By basically talking it to death.
That's the classic phrase, yeah. Extending the debate indefinitely so a vote can't happen.
And that name, filibuster,
yeah,
it doesn't exactly sound official.
No, it really doesn't. Its origins are, like you said, colorful. It comes from the Dutch freebooter.
Okay.
Which means freebooter. Think pirates, private adventurers raiding ships. Then it morphed into the Spanish filibustero, meaning like a lawless plunderer or military adventurer, often stirring up trouble in foreign lands.
So the connection is basically disruption, like political pirates hijacking the process.
Exactly. That idea of obstruction, of maybe operating outside the normal flow, of disrupting things, it captures the essence pretty well.
And it's kind of wild that this filibuster, it wasn't even written into the U.S. Constitution.
Not at all. It's not mentioned anywhere.
So how did it become such a fixture in the Senate? You mentioned it was sort of accidental.
Yeah, the groundwork was laid, maybe unintentionally, way back in 1805 by none other than Vice President Aaron Burr.
Burr. Okay, Hamilton's rival Burr.
That's the one. He was presiding over the Senate, and he suggested they clean up their rule book. One rule he thought was redundant was something called the previous question motion.
Previous question? What did that do?
Essentially, it was the mechanism the Senate had at the time that allowed a simple majority to just say, okay, enough debate, let's vote now.
Ah, so it cut off debate.
Precisely. Burr thought it was messy or unnecessary, so he recommended getting rid of it.
And they just did.
They did. In 1806, the Senate dropped the previous question motion. Crucially, though, they didn't replace it with any other way for a majority to force an end to debate.
Oops.
Kind of. It seems nobody really grasped the full implications right away. It took about 3 decades for senators to fully realize, hey, wait a minute. Without that rule, someone could technically just keep talking forever and block a vote.
Wow. So that's the accidental birth of U.S. Senate filibuster, just removing a rule and not realizing the consequence for 30 years.
Pretty much sums it up. But it wasn't like they immediately started doing these epic day-long speeches all the time.
Right. It evolved. Were there early attempts at delay tactics even before they fully realized this loophole?
Oh, yeah. Even back in 1790, when the previous question motion still technically existed but wasn't used much, there was a debate about where to temporarily locate the U.S. Capitol. Senators from Virginia and South Carolina apparently gave lengthy speeches trying to prevent Philadelphia from being chosen. So the idea of using long speeches to delay wasn't totally new.
But maybe not as formalized, or the potential wasn't fully understood.
Exactly. Then you get a more concrete example. In 1841, there was this big fight involving Senator Henry Clay and Senator Thomas Hart Benton over political appointments, patronage stuff. And the Democrats, led by Benton and Calhoun, used extended debate tactics, basically talking for about 10 days straight to try and block Clay's side.
10 days. Did it work?
Ultimately, no. The Whigs had the majority and pushed through. But it definitely showed the potential power of obstruction through delay.
Yeah.
And it's around this time, the 1840s, 1850s, that the term filibuster with that pirate connection, started getting applied to these tactics.
So the name caught on as the tactics became more visible.
Right, and by 1856, the Senate even formally acknowledged in its rules that in some situations, debate could be unlimited.
Okay, so it starts as an accident, gets used occasionally, gets a name. Then we jump forward quite a bit to 1917. That seems like a big turning point with this cloture rule.
It was huge. World War I is the backdrop. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to arm U.S. merchant ships, but a small group of about 12 anti-war senators successfully filibustered the bill, talking it to death.
Wilson must have been furious.
He was. He called them a little group of willful men and really pushed the Senate to change its rules, so a small minority couldn't just block everything.
And that led to Rule 22, cloture.
That's right. Rule 22, the cloture rule, was created. It allowed the Senate to actually end a filibuster. But, and this is key initially, it required a supermajority vote. 2/3 of the senators present and voting.
2/3. That's a really high bar.
Extremely high. So while it created a mechanism to stop a filibuster, it was still very difficult to actually invoke cloture.
Did that threshold ever change?
It did. Much later, in 1975, amidst concerns that the 2/3 rule was still making obstruction too easy, the Senate lowered the threshold
To
3/5 of the entire Senate membership. So in today's 100-seat Senate, that means 60 votes.
Ah, the magic number 60. You hear that all the time now.
Exactly. That 60-vote requirement for cloture has essentially become the de facto threshold for passing almost any major piece of legislation or confirming many nominees.
So even though the Constitution generally implies majority rule, this procedural rule effectively means you need a 60-vote supermajority for most big things.
That's the practical reality of the modern Senate, yes. A minority of 41 senators, if they stick together, can block most legislation by threatening, or actually mounting a filibuster, preventing the Senate from ever getting to a final majority vote.
Which really changes the dynamics of governing, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, it forces negotiation and bipartisan compromise, which some see as good, but it also often leads to gridlock when that compromise isn't reachable.
Okay, so we've got the definition, the accidental origin, the evolution to the 60-vote rule. Now, let's circle back to those weirder moments, that spittoon incident in 1917, seriously.
Yeah, it sounds almost cartoonish, but it reflects the intensity of the time. Senator Robert La Follette, fighting Bob La Follette, he was an anti-war progressive Republican.
Okay.
He was part of that filibuster against arming merchant ships just before the U.S. entered WWI. Emotions were running incredibly high, and apparently things got so heated in an exchange with Senator Joseph Robinson, a Democrat from Arkansas, that La Follette grabbed a heavy brass spittoon and reportedly had to be physically restrained by others from actually throwing it at Robinson.
Wow, okay, so high drama. Then Huey Long in 1935, reading recipes.
Yep, Huey the Kingfish Long, the very populous, very flamboyant Democratic governor and later senator from Louisiana. He was worried that his political enemies back home were going to get appointed to important New Deal jobs.
Right.
So to block or delay Senate business, he launched into this hours-long speech, and part of it famously involved reading recipes for Louisiana dishes like pot liquor and fried oysters.
Reading recipes on the Senate floor.
Apparently, he went on about how Northerners couldn't cook oysters properly. The filibuster only ended, legend has it, when he desperately needed to use the restroom and couldn't hold it any longer.
Nature calls. Well, speaking of which, Strom Thurmond, 1957, the pea bucket story is kind of infamous.
It is, and it shows the extreme physical endurance that the old-style talking filibuster required. Thurmond, then a Dixiecrat senator from South Carolina, was vehemently opposed to the Civil Rights Act of 1957.
Okay.
He decided to filibuster it personally and spoke for 24 hours and 18 minutes straight, a record that still stands.
How did he manage that without breaks?
Well, he reportedly prepared by taking steam baths to dehydrate himself. And the most notorious part is the claim that his staff had an intern ready in a nearby cloakroom with a bucket.
Oh my gosh.
So he could theoretically relieve himself into the bucket while keeping one foot technically on the Senate floor so he wouldn't yield his time. It's debated if he actually used it, but the preparation itself is legendary.
That is dedication or something.
And incredibly, that specific tactic was apparently imitated years later in 2001 during a filibuster at St. Louis City Hall.
Wow. Okay, jumping ahead to the 80s and 90s. Senator Alphonse D'Amato. The phone book.
Yeah, Senator Pothole, Al D'Amato, Republican from New York. In 1986, he was filibustering a military spending bill he thought unfairly cut funding for a New York-based plane.
Right.
He spoke for nearly 24 hours, 23 hours and 30 minutes, just shy of Thurman's record. And when he started running out of things to say,
You reached for the phone book.
he apparently read huge sections of the District of Columbia telephone directory. Names, numbers, just filler to keep talking and hold the floor.
Must have been riveting television.
I imagine C-SPAN viewership spiked. Maybe not.
And then he topped that off with singing in 1992.
He did. Different filibuster. This time against a tax bill he opposed because it hurt a typewriter factory in his state. He spoke for over 15 hours.
And the singing part.
At one point, he famously broke into song, singing South of the Border, Down Mexico Way.
Why that song?
He said it was to protest the bill and satirize how American jobs were supposedly going south of the border. So a bit more theatrical than the phone book, I guess.
Definitely more memorable, maybe.
Yeah.
And then, much more recently, Ted Cruz reading Dr. Seuss in 2013, that got a lot of attention.
It did. Senator Cruz spoke for over 21 hours, primarily criticizing the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, and yes, part of that involved reading Green Eggs and Ham to his daughters who were watching at home.
But you mentioned that one was maybe technically different, not a procedural filibuster.
That's a really important distinction, yeah. While it was a very long speech, and it certainly delayed proceedings, it wasn't actually blocking a specific vote that was scheduled to happen right then. Under Senate rules at that moment, his speech didn't prevent the Senate from moving forward eventually.
Ah, okay.
So it functioned more as a very high-profile protest, a way to draw attention to his opposition, rather than a filibuster in the strict procedural sense of stopping a vote. It highlights that sometimes long speeches happen that aren't technically filibusters.
Got it. So these are the famous talking filibusters, the endurance tests. But you said things have changed, shifted more to a silent filibuster.
Exactly. That's probably the biggest evolution, especially since the 1970s and that 60-vote rule change. The talking filibuster, while still possible, is much rarer now.
So what happens instead?
Now, usually a senator or a group of senators just needs to signal their intention to filibuster. They might tell their party leader, "We object to proceeding on this bill and we'll filibuster if you try."
Just the threat is enough.
Often, yes. Once that threat is clear, Senate procedures typically require the majority leader to file a cloture motion to end the potential filibuster. And then they need those 60 votes to invoke cloture and actually move forward to debate and vote on the bill itself.
So you don't need the drama of the phone book or the pea bucket anymore. Just knowing you don't have 60 votes can stop a bill cold?
Precisely. The threat of the filibuster, backed up by the knowledge that fewer than 60 senators support ending debate, is usually enough. It makes the filibuster much easier to deploy and therefore much more common than it used to be.
More of a strategic calculation than a physical feat.
Absolutely. It's become a routine part of the legislative process for almost anything controversial.
Okay, and you mentioned way back at the start that this whole concept isn't just American. Other countries have forms of this.
Yes, definitely. While the U.S. Senate's current version, the routine, often silent 60-vote requirement, is pretty unique in its impact. The basic idea of using procedural rules or long speeches to obstruct legislative action. That pops up all over the place and throughout history.
Like even ancient Rome, you mentioned Cato the Younger.
Right. Long before the U.S. existed, Cato the Younger was a staunch opponent of Julius Caesar in the Roman Senate. His tactic apparently was just to talk and talk.
And talk.
Until nightfall. The Roman Senate had a rule that all business had to wrap up by dusk. So if Cato just kept speaking on a topic he opposed, he could effectively run out the clock for the day and prevent a vote. Genius, in a way.
A very old form of talking something to death. What about modern parliaments, like those based on the British Westminster system?
You see variations there too, though often they have stricter rules about how long someone can speak. In Australia, for example, standing orders usually limit speech times, making a U.S.-style talking filibuster difficult.
But they find other ways.
Sometimes. Procedural maneuvers, like trying to suspend the rules or long questioning in committees. We saw an example in 2022 where a senator grilled ministers in a committee for about 9 hours, which effectively acted as a filibuster at that stage.
Okay. And Canada, they've had some big ones, right? Like that 58-hour one.
Yeah, the New Democratic Party, NDP, back in 2011 used procedural rules related to voting on amendments to stretch out the debate on a back-to-work bill for Canada Post workers for 58 hours, a real marathon session.
Wow.
And Canada's had specific MPs known for their skill at delaying committee work with long speeches. There was even an odd case in Newfoundland where the governing party basically debated their own budget bill because the opposition was ready to vote, but they weren't.
That's unusual.
And Ontario had instances like thousands of amendments being proposed to slow down the creation of the Toronto Macocity. So Lots of procedural creativity.
Seems like a common theme. What about other places? India, Ireland, New Zealand.
Well, in India's upper house, the Rajya Sabha, a simple majority can usually vote to end debate. In the lower house, Lok Sabha, it's more up to the speaker. Ireland had a minister accused of a drone attack filibuster in 2014 for speaking at length.
Drone attack.
Yeah, just a colorful name for perceived excessive talking. And New Zealand's seen tactics like demanding divisions or slow voting, even members insisting on voting in Maori, which requires translation and slows things down, plus wrecking amendments, tons of minor, sometimes silly amendments to clog the process.
Like renaming Auckland Council to the Ketchafire Council?
Exactly, stuff like that. And the UK itself, the Westminster Parliament, has a long history of bills being talked out, especially private members' bills, which have limited debate time allocated.
So if someone just talks for the whole time slot?
The bill dies, yeah. It's happened on issues from Irish Home Rule in the 19th century to hunting with dogs, FOIA exemptions, voting system changes, even pardons for historical homosexual offenses more recently.
So common there, too, within the rules. Any records for longest speeches?
The UK Commons record is technically 6 hours by Henry Brougham in 1828, but that wasn't really a filibuster, more just a very long speech on law reform. Andrew Dismore holds the 21st century record at 3 hours 17 minutes, which was related to delaying a bill. And Northern Ireland had a 9.5-hour speech back in 1936.
Okay, so it's definitely a global toolkit, maybe used differently. What about non-Westminster systems?
Oh, yeah. Austria's seen 12-hour speeches. The Philippines had an 18-hour one.
Okay.
France is interesting. They have speech time limits, but opposition parties sometimes introduce tens of thousands of amendments to obstruct.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah, the record was over 137,000 amendments on a gas privatization bill in 2006, just burying the process in paperwork.
That's incredible.
Chile's seen multi-hour speeches recently. Hong Kong has used filibustering via amendments extensively. Italy has obstruction traditions. Iran had a famous 4-day speech during oil nationalization debates. South Korea had an insane 193-hour team filibuster in 2016 against an anti-terrorism bill.
193 hours.
Yeah, multiple lawmakers speaking back-to-back. And South Korea's parliament has historically had physical fights too, so maybe long speeches are an improvement.
Maybe. And Spain, in Catalonia.
They attempted a filibuster using procedural debates to try and stall the independence referendum process in 2017. So really, you see these delaying tactics everywhere, adapted to the local rules and political culture.
It's fascinating how widespread the basic impulse is, even if the specifics vary so much. But let's bring it back to the U.S. again. It's obviously super controversial here. What are the main pro and con arguments people make?
Well, the main argument for the filibuster, at least traditionally, is that it protects the rights of the minority party. It forces the majority to slow down, to listen to opposing views, and ideally, to build broader consensus before making big changes.
So it encourages deliberation and compromise.
That's the idea, yes. To prevent a narrow majority from just steamrolling the minority on major issues.
Okay. And the arguments against, they seem pretty loud these days.
They are. The biggest criticism is that it leads to gridlock and obstructionism. That it allows a minority, sometimes a small minority, to block popular legislation or necessary government functions simply because they can. And that the 60-vote reality effectively paralyzes the Senate much of the time.
Making it impossible to get anything done, basically.
That's the fear, yeah. And then there's the really heavy historical baggage.
Right, the connection to blocking civil rights, that label Jim Crow relic.
Exactly. You can't talk about the filibuster's history in the U.S. without acknowledging its extensive use by Southern senators for decades, specifically to block anti-lynching laws, voting rights bills, and other crucial civil rights legislation.
That's a dark history.
It undeniably is, and it heavily fuels the arguments for reform or abolition today. The idea that a tool used so effectively to uphold racial segregation is fundamentally tainted.
And we have seen some tweaks around the edges, right? This nuclear option thing for nominations.
Yes. Faced with filibusters blocking presidential appointments, both Democrats and Republicans, when in the majority, have used a procedural maneuver nicknamed the nuclear option.
Why nuclear?
Because it involves changing the Senate rules for presidents with just a simple majority vote, blowing up the previous standard. They first did it for lower court and executive nominees, lowering the cloture threshold to 51 votes.
Okay.
And then later, it was extended to Supreme Court nominations as well. So for most presidential appointments now, you only need a simple majority to confirm them.
But not for legislation. That still needs 60 votes to break a filibuster.
Correct. The 60-vote threshold for cloture on legislation remains largely intact, which is why the debate continues to be so fierce about whether to keep it, modify it further, or get rid of it entirely for laws, too.
And it really does seem, comparing it to all those other countries, that the U.S. version, especially this routine, often silent 60-vote hurdle for laws, is kind of unique in its power and frequency of use.
That seems fair to say. While obstruction exists elsewhere, the way the filibuster currently operates in the U.S. Senate, requiring a supermajority for almost everything, does seem particularly impactful and, frankly, more central to the legislative process than is most other comparable democracies.
So wrapping this up, it's clear the filibuster isn't just some dry Senate rule. It's got this really weird, long, kind of accidental history. It's led to some bizarre moments, recipes, phone books, spittoons.
The greatest hits, yeah.
But its actual impact on governing, on what gets done or doesn't get done, is huge and super contested. And while blocking tactics aren't only American, the way it works here now, especially that 60-vote hurdle, seems pretty distinct.
Absolutely. And understanding that history and those mechanics gives you, the listener, so much valuable context for watching political debates unfold today. You can see the challenges in passing laws, not just here, but in other systems too. It really drives home how rules, even ones that may be started by accident, can shape everything.
Yeah, those unintended consequences really stack up.
They do.
So, maybe a final thought to chew on. Considering it started almost by mistake and how it's been used and changed over centuries and across different countries, is the filibuster in any form really a necessary shield for minority rights and careful debate? Or has it mostly become an outdated weapon that just breeds gridlock and stops governments from actually solving problems? Something to think about.